Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Sea Power convenes this morning to examine Navy shipbuilding programs. We welcome our three distinguished witnesses, Ms. Allison F. Stiller, performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition. Vice Admiral William K. Lescher, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Integration of Capabilities and Resources. And that's a mouthful. And Lieutenant General Robert S. Walsh, Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration. Our subcommittee is grateful to all of you for your decades of service. We are at a critical juncture for shipbuilding. We currently have 276 ships in the fleet. In 2016, after deliberation and consideration, the Navy increased its requirement to 355 ships for the battle fleet, a figure that is supported by a number of congressionally mandated future fleet architecture studies. Admiral Richardson, the Chief of Naval Operations, believes we need to reach the 355 ship objective in the 2020s. Given the timelines for new ship construction, such as the 5 years it takes to build a new submarine, the nation must commit to building a bigger Navy now. While I support the budget request's focus on improving readiness, I agree with the CNO that we must build more ships at the same time. The Navy's FY 2018 budget request includes funding for 8 new construction ships, which is one less than the number procured in 2017. Following the budget submission, the administration announced a request for a second littoral combat ship, but Congress has not received the formal documentation. While the budget request is a good start, the shipbuilding industrial base can support higher levels of shipbuilding today. In fact, the CNO's white paper, The Future Navy, states that the industrial base could build 29 additional ships over the next 7 years, over and above those that are already projected. Given sufficient and stable funding, industry leaders told the subcommittee that their shipyards are up to the task. In addition to new ship construction, some naval analysts have proposed increasing the size of the fleet through reactivating ships, extending service life, and other alternatives. The subcommittee will explore all options. The nation has supported a major fleet expansion before. During the Reagan-era buildup, the Navy added 91 ships to the fleet in 8 years. This subcommittee wants to help the Navy build a firm foundation in this year's authorization bill to support a substantial buildup in the near future. There is no time to waste. Our real and potential adversaries are outcompeting the United States in this area. Our maritime edge is eroding. If we fail, I believe General Dunford's assessment will come to pass that within 5 years we will lose our ability to project power, the basis for how we defend the homeland, advance U.S. interests, and meet our alliance commitments. These are the words of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I would like to hear our witnesses' views on this critical juncture and 4 other key issues. First, industrial base vitality. The Navy must comply with the law and submit its 30-year shipbuilding plan to Congress. The strength of our shipbuilding industrial base will determine the viability of the plan. Reaching the Navy's 355 ship objective is not possible without the unique skills, capabilities, and capacities inherent found in the new construction shipyards, repair facilities, and among our dedicated suppliers. The witnesses should describe the budget request's effects on the shipbuilding industrial base. Subcommittee would also like to hear about ways in which Congress can help support the industrial base. Second, best use of taxpayers' resources. The subcommittee will conduct rigorous oversight of shipbuilding programs to ensure the Navy is making the best use of taxpayer dollars. Congress expects Navy shipbuilding programs to deliver promised capability on time and on budget. Schedule delays and cost growth put additional strain on the legacy platforms which these new ships will replace. Specifically, I'm interested in understanding why the cost of the USS Enterprise CVN 80, is more than $1 billion greater than the previous aircraft carrier, USS John F. Kennedy. I also remain concerned that the key warfighting capabilities of the LCS, including mine countermeasures and anti-submarine warfare, have fallen years behind schedule and remain unproven. The witnesses should address the Navy's plan to pursue full and open competition in selecting a new frigate with greater lethality and survivability. Third, building the future force. This subcommittee also has a duty to shape the future of our Navy. Each of our surface combatant ships, cruisers, destroyers, and littoral combat ships will begin retiring within the next 20 years. Now is the time to determine the requirements for our future surface combatants, as well as the munitions they will carry. I remain concerned that the Columbia-class submarine program, second largest DoD acquisition program, may stress our already constrained shipbuilding budget. This is an important program, but we do need to look at the strains it places on the budget. And fourthly, amphibious ships. The Navy and Marine Corps continue to serve as the linchpin of American force projection around the globe. I'm interested in ways we can address the demand from our combatant commanders for amphibious ships. The combatant commanders need more than 50 amphibious ships on a day-to-day operational basis, but the current inventory includes only 31 amphibious ships. The witnesses should discuss the Navy's ability to accelerate procurement of the next amphibious assault ship, known as the LXR. So thank you to our witnesses, and thank you to interested Americans who are attending. And I now recognize my good friend and ranking member, Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join the chairman in welcoming our witnesses this morning. Over the weekend, we all learned about the tragedy on the USS Fitzgerald. Our thoughts are with the USS Fitzgerald crew and the families of the 7 sailors who lost their lives in service to our country. These 7 young men represented diverse backgrounds, but were united in their service to our country. As we honor their lives, we must also move forward to support their fellow sailors and Marines. Over the past weeks, we have held a number of hearings on the future of a number of Navy and Marine Corps programs. Today's witnesses will also tell us about the balancing act our military faces. On one hand, they need to support ongoing operations and sustain readiness. On the other, they need to modernize and keep the technological advantage that is critical to military success. All of this under the cloud of limits imposed by the Budget Control Act. While that law necessarily raised the debt ceiling, it also imposed draconian caps on defense and non-defense programs and included sequestration. Sequestration, or automatic across-the-board cuts, was included as a worst-case scenario to motivate Congress. And the mindless cuts to defense and non-defense programs brought by sequestration were meant to be so bad that Congress would move forward, would be forced to find an alternative way forward. We all learned a lesson in 2013 when sequester was allowed to take effect. In fact, some in our industrial base are still working through the aftermath of that fiasco. Yet here we are, 6 years later, living under the caps and in fear of sequestration and what it would do. Funding for critical programs, both defense and non-defense, is not an either-or proposition. We cannot enact the priorities and programs discussed today until we lift the caps and eliminate the fear of sequester. I look forward to working with the chairman and other committee members to balance the needs of our military with critical domestic programs. It has been long enough, and the time for leadership is certainly now. With that in mind, a continuing focus of this subcommittee has been to see that we improve our acquisition stewardship and thereby ensure that we are getting good value for every shipbuilding dollar that we spend. The big news this year is the increase in force structure that was recommended by Chief of Naval Operations' most recent force structure assessment. The Navy has not submitted a plan, and the chairman has mentioned this also, for ramping to meet this new 355 ship goal, but we hope to gain some insight into what reasonable steps we could take now to help the Navy achieve this increase. Eventually, we will need to increase attack submarines and major surface combatants to much higher force levels. The Navy was supposed to implement an engineering change proposal for the DDG-51 destroyer program to include the Air and Missile Defense Radar, or AMDR, on one of the ships in the FY16 shipbuilding program. To date, the Navy has not signed a contract for that upgrade. We need to assess why this has been delayed and whether the Navy and contractors are making sufficient progress on the AMDR program to award a new multi-year procurement program in fiscal year 2018. I know that the Navy conducted what by all accounts was successful testing of the AMDR system at the Pacific Missile Range Facility, or PMRF, located on the island of Kauai. I hope we can hear from Secretary Stiller on this important program as well, and look forward to hearing your testimony this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Who would like to go first on the testimony? Ms. Stiller?
Yes, sir. I'm going to give an opening statement for the three of us.
Excellent.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Hirono, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the Department of Navy's shipbuilding programs. Each day, we are mindful of our men and women in uniform serving this great nation, and we especially hold the USS Fitzgerald sailors and their families and friends in our thoughts and prayers. I'm joined this morning by Lieutenant General Bob Walsh, Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration, and Vice Admiral Bill Lescher, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Integration of Capabilities and Resources. I request that our written statement be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. On behalf of our Navy and Marine Corps, we want to thank this subcommittee for your strong support in the FY 2017 Defense Authorization and Appropriations bills. Not only has Congress supported our request, but the committee increased funding for many of our critical programs. We're committed to making good on that investment and to do so in the most fiscally responsible manner possible to provide the ships, aircraft, vehicles, and weapons that are needed for our men and women in uniform to be successful. We've continued to leverage every tool available to drive down cost. We've tightened requirements, maximized competition, capitalized on multi-year and block buy procurements, explored cross-program efficiencies, and attacked our cost of doing business so that more of our resources can be dedicated to the warfighting capability. Global activities over the last year have made it clear that security challenges are intensifying at an increasingly rapid pace. To remain competitive, it is imperative that we continuously adapt to the emerging security environment and do so with a sense of urgency. This requires us to work closely with Congress to return budget stability and predictability to the Department, which necessitates increasing defense caps under the Budget Control Act. Our 2018 President's budget submission is governed by SecDef's priorities to improve warfighting readiness by addressing pressing programmatic shortfalls that have accrued from 15 years of wartime operational tempo. The budget maintains the operational effectiveness of our current force while also building a bridge to growing the future force starting in 2019. Over the past year, 11 ships were delivered and an additional 12 ships were christened. One of the ships delivered this year was DDG-1000 USS Zumwalt, a truly transformational platform. And just last month, CVN-78 Gerald R. Ford, our newest aircraft carrier, was delivered to our Navy. And this past Friday, we awarded the detailed design and construction contract for LHA-8 Bougainville. Today, there are 61 ships under contract and 44 are in construction. These include aircraft carriers, submarines, large surface combatants, small surface combatants, amphibious ships, and auxiliary ships. The shipyards constructing these vessels have a vast infrastructure of suppliers supporting them, and we are mindful of this industrial base as we build our budgets and recapitalize our force. I would like to briefly discuss a couple of items posed by our budget request. First, as mentioned, we've requested multi-year procurement authority for the FY18 to FY22 DDG-51 Flight 3 buy. We have a handshake agreement with Huntington Ingalls Industries to introduce the Flight 3 capability on their FY17 ship, the last of this current multi-year. And we are also requesting multi-year procurement authority for the FY19 to FY23 Virginia class, which will introduce the Virginia payload module capability. In both cases, the multi-year criteria laid out by Congress is met. Second, we have made a couple of adjustments to our 5-year shipbuilding plan. We added a Virginia-class submarine in FY21, and we deferred the start of the frigate program from FY19 to FY20 while we revisit the ship's requirements. Our small surface combatant requirement remains at 52 ships, and we desire to transition to the frigate as soon as possible. The administration supports funding a second LCS in FY18, and an amendment to the President's budget is expected to be delivered to the Congress very soon. We note that our shipbuilding plan beyond FY18 may be adjusted in our PB19 submission as a result of the Defense Strategic Review that will complete later this summer, consistent with SecDef's FY19 priority to grow a larger, more lethal force. In summary, the Navy's 2018 budget is focused on improving the wholeness of our current forces. We greatly appreciate this subcommittee's strong and consistent support of your sailors and Marines. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stiller, and thank you to our other witnesses. Well, let me ask about the 355 ship requirement. I jotted down some words that you used, which I think should be instructive to the Congress and also to the public. Ms. Stiller, you talked about the emerging security environment, which is much more dangerous than it has been. And you said that we must proceed with a sense of urgency. As chairman of this subcommittee, I can tell you that I want to help you proceed with that sense of urgency on a number of these issues, including accelerating the 355 ship buildup. This has been asked a number of times in this subcommittee, and so I want to make sure that we understand with regard to the requirement of 355 ships. That requirement includes a requirement that those ships be fully staffed with additional personnel. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that they be, and that we have the capability of having the aircraft that is required for that size fleet?
Yes, sir.
And that we have the munitions that a 355 ship fleet with that particular mix, with the appropriate mix, would need to get the job done.
Yes, sir.
And so it's not just building these floating fortresses, but it's making them fully operational. And the requirement is that we be able to have all of that in a package that gets us up to 355. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What options is the Navy exploring, and this is to any of you, to grow the size of the fleet more rapidly?
Mr. Chairman, I'll take a stab at that. So the Navy's looking at a very comprehensive approach to accelerate the growth of the fleet, as the CNO has talked extensively about, with a sense of urgency to bring a broader capability, a more capable, more lethal Navy in the 2020s. One element of that is clearly new construction that we've talked about, and that is featured in the force structure assessment, a very analytical look at the way we've operated the force over a decade and a half of wartime op-tempo, at the current security environment, and our commitment to combatant commanders in terms of presence and surgeability. Beyond that, the Navy is also looking at service life extensions on existing platforms. So Vice Admiral Tom Moore at NAVSEA, Naval Sea Systems Command, is leading an effort right now, and it shows some potential to extend service lives, both hull mechanical and electrical, as well as combat systems in cruisers, destroyers, amphibs, logistic force ships. And then we're also looking at reactivation of ships. This is something that is an ongoing analysis right now. We're going to have to look very carefully at that because the ships that have been decommissioned are older and have older combat systems, and so we have to have a strong look at the return on investment from that approach. But between all of those elements, a very comprehensive approach at accelerating the growth to the 355-ship Navy.
When do you think you might have something to us about whether reactivation is pragmatic, doable?
Sure. I'll take that for the record and talk to Admiral Moore and the team he's leading. I know they're looking at that aggressively. I don't have a sense for specifically when they will develop that insight, so we'll get back to you.
Okay, now we're going to have a 30-year shipbuilding plan, which is required of the Navy. When's that coming? When do you think that's coming, Ms. Stiller?
Sir, we are staffing that 30-year shipbuilding plan now. As you know, that has to be signed out by the Secretary of Defense's office. Another nuance, just to make sure you're aware, is that part of the language that requires submittal of the plan also requires us to certify that the plan that we submit is adequately funded. And so as we're looking at today's FIDIP, we don't see growth in the out years at any kind of rate. So the 355 ship plan would be addressed in a future 30-year shipbuilding plan, because this current budget environment doesn't give us that assurance to be able to certify.
Okay, yes, I wanted the committee to fully understand this. I'm probably, at first blush, going to be a little disappointed when I see this shipbuilding plan, but it's not because the leadership of the Navy represented at this table and on up, to include the top leadership of DOD, doesn't believe in the 355 ship idea. It's because you're constrained by the statute to put only a certain level of shipbuilding on paper until we get the funding straightened out.
Yes, sir. I was just going to say, yeah, the law stipulates that we certify in the 30-year shipbuilding plan that it's funded in the program.
Good. Well, we're going to try to help you on that. And unless any of you have any follow-up on that, I'll be happy now to turn the questioning over to my good friend, Ms. Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Lescher, I just want to get clarification then. The ways to get to the 355 ship number, and you cited 3 ways: new construction, extend service life of our ships, and then to reactivate ships. Are there numbers attached to these 3 ways that you intend to, or you see getting us to 355 ships?
Ma'am, there's definitely numbers attached to the new construction element, which is the force structure assessment.
Yes.
The examination of service life extensions and how it can accelerate the path to 355 beyond just what's available in the industrial base and reactivations, that's analysis that's going on right now at Naval Sea Systems Command. So I do not have numbers right now for you.
So that you were just talking about reactivation, or the extending the life of our
For
current
both. That's both
Both.
ongoing work right now.
So there'll be an assessment of how many ships can actually be brought back and how many can be extended.
Yes.
And when is the time frame for that assessment?
So I'll take that for the record and talk to Admiral Moore and see what the time frame to complete that analysis on both those pieces is.
So I wanted to ask you again, well, not again, Admiral Lescher. You know, I and others on the SAS committee, as well as on the subcommittee, have been very focused on what we need to do in the Asia-Pacific area. And I'd like to ask you, how are you incorporating the shift to the Asia-Pacific as you consider expanding the fleet to deploy the number of ships you need? And where are you intending to base this larger fleet?
So this broader approach of the approach to the Asia Pacific encompasses a number of elements that I think in some respects you're tracking. In terms of the actual number of ships that we're deploying, you're familiar with the Navy commitment to have 60% of the fleet in the Asia Pacific or in the Pacific Fleet by 2020. So that's going to grow the physical number of ships on the order from 160 in FY16, I believe, to 176 in FY20. The number of deployments will increase as well. Beyond that, the Navy is preferentially deploying our newest capability to Asia Pacific. So whether it's P-8, E-2D, F-35B, F-35C, MQ-4 Triton, those newer capabilities are going first to the Asia Pacific region. And same thing applies for our ships as well. So whether it's Zumwalt, DDG, Flight 3, the newest, most capable ships will go to Asia Pacific. So it's a combination of numbers, it's a combination of capability, and then, as you indicated, the infrastructure to support that as well. General Walsh might talk about some of the particular work that's going on in Guam as a hub of activity. Of course, we have submarines forward deployed there as well. And then the infrastructure required for this balance in Hawaii and broader areas is part of ongoing investment. So across all those elements.
So when you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about the movement of a number of our troops from Futenma to Guam and recycling through Australia and eventually to Hawaii. General Walsh, would you like to add something to this discussion?
What I would add on to just the amphibious piece that Admiral Lescher talked about as part of this growth is we increased the number of the size of the fleet, and we increased the size on the current growth path we're on with the amphibious forces. The plan is to put a second amphibious ready group in the Pacific. Currently, the one that we have right now is in Sasebo with the 31st MEU, so that's part of that. But any other further questions on the Guam relocation? We're continuing to execute that plan.
Thank you. Yes, we need to keep that, keep the Futenma issue on track, I would say. I mentioned in my opening statement that the Navy had been testing an engineering development model of the Air and Missile Defense Radar, AMDR, at PMRF. The Navy's testing of AMDR was supposed to allow the Navy to award a contract for an engineering change proposal last fall to upgrade one of the fiscal year DDG-51 destroyers to a Flight 3 configuration. Secretary Stiller, could you give us an update on the Navy's progress in signing a contract for the engineering change? What's been why has there been a delay in signing this engineering change proposal, and does this delay have any implications for the Navy being ready to sign a multi-year procurement contract in fiscal year F-18, and how many DDG-51s could the industrial base handle in fiscal year 18? So I hope you can remember all the series of questions.
If I don't, please remind me. But yes, ma'am, let me give you a status on Flight 3. From a ship design perspective, we're at 86% complete with the design to introduce Flight 3 to the DDG-51. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have a handshake agreement with Ingalls to introduce that engineering change proposal on their FY-17 ship. We recently received a proposal from Bath Iron Works for their ECP, and we're in negotiations with them. We've also received a bid from them on their 16 ship as a Flight 2A, and we're also asking them to also give us an ECP to look at that as a Flight 3. But talking about the radar, as you mentioned, is doing quite well. It's in testing. We've been before the OSD Defense Acquisition Board and gotten permission to proceed to buy the radars for those ships. And we've also are testing our Aegis combat system that will marry up with that radar, and testing is going well. All the way along, we have the radar folks, the shipbuilding folks, the government folks, the combat systems folks working together. So there's no mystery here. But where we will be at start of construction with the 18 multi-year, we'll 100% complete with design. As I said, we're 86% complete today. We completed our CDR back in November of 2016. And you asked me about number of ships in the multi-year. Our request is 10. Certainly the industrial base can handle more than 2 a year, but our request right now in our budget constrained environment is for 10 in the multi-year. I think I got all your questions.
I think so. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me thank you all for your service to our country. Admiral Lescher, recently the proposed budget for 2018 requests the funding, if I'm correct in my addition, of 8 additional ships, based on the administration's proposal for a 350-ship Navy and the current fleet at 275 ships. First of all, I'm just curious, and just a confirmation that the 350-ship number is an appropriate number in your opinion. And second of all, is the current FY 2018 ship construction plan in line with the strategic goals of the United States Navy?
Yes, sir. 355 ships delineated in the force structure assessment is the correct number. It is the objective number. The FY18 budget submission, with the addition of the second littoral combat ship that the administration has indicated is forthcoming, an amendment would bring it to 9 ships in FY18, 8 right now, as you cited. And I'm sorry,
Just curious as to the, is it in line with the strategic goals of the United States Navy?
so it's aligned in this manner. The Secretary of Defense has talked very extensively about the path to get to a larger, more capable, more lethal Navy that we all believe is urgently required. And the path that he laid out in his direction, he calls a 3-phase campaign plan to get there. FY17, with the request for additional appropriations, which we thank the committee and the broader Congress for enacting, was all about getting after the readiness debt that we've, all the services have accumulated over the course of this decade and a half of wartime op tempo. FY18, this budget is to build on that readiness recovery and address pressing shortfalls, wholeness issues. So you see, for example, in the Navy budget, strong focus on ship depot maintenance, on aviation depot maintenance, on the flight hour program, on the steaming days program, and funding the enabling readiness accounts to elevate the readiness of the force. That's across spares, logistics, and depot support funding. So it sets the condition now. That's the design of this budget, to set the condition for the 3rd phase of the campaign plan the Secretary has talked about, which is an FY19 budget, given the relief from the defense caps in the Budget Control Act that will support and make actionable the growth of capacity and modernization as well. So that's really the strategic concept.
Curious, the relationship between the ability of the industry and the depot capabilities. Is there a relationship or a limitation there between the number of new ships or boats that can be delivered and the number of existing submarines, as an example, that can be appropriately depoted? Is there a limiting relationship between the two? Are there suppliers? Are there limiting processes here that we should be aware of? And I'm thinking in particular, just as an example, the USS Boise.
Right.
It's sitting at dock. It is not usable. It is an asset which most certainly, I believe the Navy had anticipated would be usable.
Yes, sir.
Is there a relationship between the numbers that we're building versus the numbers that we're trying to get through depot?
Yes, sir. No, it's a great question. I'll ask Ms. Siller to talk in a moment, but to your point, I think your insight's right on, which is a submarine we have that's not deployable because we can't execute the depot maintenance on it is every bit as lost an opportunity as a submarine we didn't build. We're very focused on increasing the throughput in our public nuclear-capable shipyards to get after the issue. Prioritization being on the ballistic missile submarines, the nuclear aircraft carriers, and then attack submarines are 3rd in priority right now, and that's what led to the prioritization of Boise not being it.
Share with me this, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm really curious. Clearly, we have some very, very smart people within the Navy. This is not a surprise that you now have 3 of these submarines, which are sitting basically at dock, are not in depot. I don't think that this was simply a case of malfeasance. This is not a case of where there wasn't an understanding that it needed to be done. Would you share with the committee what causes this type of a backup at dock, please?
Yes, sir. Part of it is us learning about the dynamics of growing the capacity in our shipyards. So as we saw, for example, the LA-class submarines come into midlife as a surge in workload, along with refuelings on the aircraft carriers, people certainly were looking at that forthcoming bow wave of workload and trying to be thoughtful about growing the capacity of our 4 public shipyards to get after that. So we're on a path, and in this budget, continue that path, for example, to grow labor in the public shipyards from 33,800 full-time equivalents in this budget to 36,100. I think what was a little bit of a learning curve here is understanding what happens to the demographics of the labor force in the shipyard as you grow it that quickly. So we're at a place right now where well over 50% of the people in our public shipyards have less than 5 years of experience. And so the training element of taking a new hire, becoming an artisan, is something that was learned and understood in terms of how productive they are. I think in aggregate, what that led is to insufficient capacity. Even as it was growing, it was insufficient rate of growth of capacity in the public yards that led to us not being able to put through all these submarines.
Well, if I could, and my time has expired, I'm just going to ask one thing for the record, please.
Sure.
when would this backlog of existing assets, when would this this backlog of existing submarines be taken care of in the current budget process? Could you share that with us, either for just, if you want to just...
Sir. So what the Navy is doing to get after that backlog, there's a number of investments in this budget. I talked about the growth in the labor elements. There's growth in improving the infrastructure itself, capital investment in the shipyards at rates well above what's legislated to increase the throughput. And again, that's the bottom line goal here. We need to buy and increase throughput. The other thing you see in this budget and planning continue, and it gets back to the foundation of your question of the relationship between the nuclear-capable shipbuilding industry and our public depots, is we're leveraging across both to get after this. Both on we'll bring touch labor out of...
But, look, I'm going to run out of time, but just, I'd like if you could get back to us with a timeline
Roger.
for the elimination of that backlog.
Fair enough. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stiller, welcome. Delighted to have you here and to discuss these important issues. I've probably been to a dozen hearings, maybe more, about procurement and particularly about procurement problems. It always seems to come back to trying to build something while you're designing it. And changes in requirements, changes in design, unanticipated changes, that whether it's the F-35 or any of the other big issues that we've been dealing with. I am very much in favor of multi-year contracts for all the reasons you've stated. Taxpayer savings, better for the industrial base. I am worried, however, about the Flight 3 being ready for multi-year. You've testified, and Mr. Stackley testified the other day, 86% design complete. But generally, one of the criteria, and the GAO talks about this, is not only complete design, but having built one or two and having seen how it actually works and whether the cost estimates are realistic. And you mentioned that you have an agreement with Ingalls, a handshake, to build one. My only request is to consider slowing the multi-year down, maybe 6 months, in order to start construction on the first Flight 3 before we buy 10 ships and ask our industrial base to make commitments based upon not an unproven design, but a new design and a substantially changed design. This isn't minor changes. This is much more than the Flight 2A changes. So it really is a question of not whether there should be a multi-year, but when, and when do we get to the point where we have full confidence, enough confidence to buy 10 at a time. So could you give me your thoughts?
Yes, sir, and I look at the multi-years that we've sent over, both for Virginia and DDG 51, kind of in the same boat. We're going to introduce the Virginia payload module into the Virginia multi-year as well. Right now, that's a year behind because we're asking for that multi-year starts in 19. But to give you some perspective, that design is approximately 10% complete today. Obviously, we'll be in the 80% complete when we get to that multi-year as well, and close to 100 by the time we start construction. The way we're trying to mitigate the risk on the 51 program is by trying to introduce that Flight 3 ECP into this last multi-year, the one that ends in 17, on the last ships of those multi-years. And as I pointed out, we have a handshake with Ingalls. We are in negotiations with Bath. We feel like that the design is mature and that we understand it. We want to continue to work with the companies. Obviously, it will take us time. We'll have a competition for the multi-year. I can't tell you exactly when we'll award. We usually never award on the first day of the fiscal year anyway. We're never that prepared. But I would tell you that I have high confidence that we have the design well in hand. Both yards have been on schedule on design.
And the design, but again, generally in the past when there's a multi-year, one or two have been built. Not only the design, but you have something afloat that you can say, did it work? Or were the prices realistic? Did we understand the risks? And were there design changes during construction? I'm just suggesting, again, not stepping away from the multi-year, but just a question of timing to be sure that we get it right, because you're asking our yards to take a big risk on 10 ships. that none of which have ever been, none of that design have ever been built before. That's my question.
Yes, sir, and I understand your concern, but we have been successful in doing this in the past, and I'll point out on the Virginia side, this current multi-year that we're in, we introduced additional change into that ship design as we did block upgrades. We talk about the blocks on Virginia. We have introduced, at a lesser extent on DDG 51 over the years, change. We view that the amount of change in this particular Flight 3 design, it touched about 45 to 50% of the drawings.
That's
In fact,
not inconsiderable.
I know that's not, but it's along the same lines on the Virginia as well. And in fact, in the Flight 2A, we touched more drawings on Flight 2A than we are on Flight 3. But that aside, we've also were not nearly as complete with design when we introduced Flight 2A, as we are making ourselves and holding ourselves to be disciplined about making sure we're at a certain percent design complete before we start getting into construction. So I think we have changed our processes and the way that we look at percent design complete to make sure that we're not putting undue risk.
I appreciate that, and again, I'm a big supporter of multi-year. I'm a big supporter of Flight 3. I think it's going to bring a major advantage to the fleet, and we want to get it as soon as possible, but I'd rather get it right than get it fast. Thank you very much.
No
So,
disagreement, yes, sir.
Ms. Stiller, with regard to 2A, those concerns, as Senator King mentioned, in your view, turned out to be unfounded?
I would say 2A goes back quite a bit, but certainly there were challenges on the lead ships, but I would also, when we went to Flight 2A, but I would also tell you that we went into Flight 2A with a much less percent complete of the design products. That's one thing we've learned, and the Congress has stressed, and we have taken that to heart before we get into, for example, Columbia. The lead Columbia, we predict will be 83% complete design before we start construction. That's far better than we saw. Seawolf, Virginia even was only about in the mid 40% complete when we started that program. So we understand the reasons that we need to get percent complete design way up there before we start construction, and we're committed to it. And we've learned our lessons. And back to your comment about having on time and on schedule, that resonates with us because it's important to us to be able to make sure that we're affordably procuring these assets.
On the Flight 3, how much do you think we're going to save by doing it this way?
Well, the Flight 3 capability will cost more. The radar is a bit more expensive, but not very much.
How much are we going to save through using multi-year?
Oh, on the DDG 51, we predict we're nearly 10%, and on the Virginia, we're at 14%. We obviously have to go through the certification process with the CAPE, and so those numbers will solidify over time, and certainly having industry bids will help us to inform. But we always see on multi-years that we get at least 10% savings.
Okay. Well, Senator King has expressed a concern, and so I hope you'll work with us to see if we can achieve a consensus.
Yes, sir, and we'll lay out the schedules for Senator King to show you what our timeline is. I don't have that off the top of my head.
Senator Strange.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for their appearance here today. I appreciate your service as well. I appreciated Senator Round's and the question to Admiral Lescher about shipyard expertise. That's an issue of particular concern to me, and I think we see how it affects various aspects of the programs we're trying to achieve. As I know you well know, Madam Secretary, there are 21,000 men and women at 2 shipyards, 1,200 suppliers in 45 states who support the current LCS program. I'm very pleased with the administration's decision to add an additional ship in the budget and look forward to seeing that. It's not sufficient in my view, and I'll certainly be weighing in on that subject, but it's a step in the right direction, and I greatly appreciate that. Back to the issue of shipyard capability and efficiency, should we agree to cut production back in those shipyards, in my view, it'll have a significant effect on efficiency, competition, and other factors, particularly price. And in my view, that's, in this current budget environment, a very significant concern. So in my view, if we truly want to grow our Navy fleet, which I strongly support, to the 350 to 355, we've got to expand the LCS frigate program rather than cut it back at this time. So I guess my question is pretty basic. If we want to achieve that goal, does cutting back on the frigate LCS program help us achieve that goal? How does it impact in your view, how we get to that goal in the most efficient, cost-effective way that actually delivers something that our warfighters need in the theater? Whoever would like to take a shot at that?
Well, sir, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we have a requirement for 52 small surface combatants, and we want to get to the frigate as soon as we possibly can. We had taken a pause to go and, with the emerging threat environment out there, to take a look again at the requirements to make sure we have it right. So as we transition from the LCS to the frigate, that's why we put in quantities to bridge to getting to frigate, and no, they are not at the optimal build rates for the yards, but they are where we feel that we're at minimum sustaining rate, so that we can transition to frigate, because we want that 52 total number to have a number that are frigates. 20 is where our head's been for a while now. And so we realize that we can't just turn off LCS and immediately get to frigate, and so that's why you see ships added, because we are mindful that we have an industrial base out there that we don't want to walk away from, because they are a critical part of our ability to build the ships. Admiral, if you wanted to comment on the requirements.
No, absolutely. And so this is very much intersection of sustaining the industrial base and getting the design and the requirements right, and quite frankly, working with the industry to get them right. So, Senator, I know you're very familiar with the evolution requirements and the concept of the littoral comp ships we've put on contract are absolutely needed by the fleet. Admiral Roden, the Surface Force Commander, said, I need them now, I need more of them. At the same time, as we broaden our operational concept to distributed maritime operations, distributed lethality, looking for these ships to operate not only in the littorals, but perhaps more independently. That's what's driving them from being a single mission focus to a multi-mission focus. And so as we mature those requirements and work with industry to understand where the need and the curve is for most capability for price, that also drives very much into this timeline that you talked about.
Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to following up on that issue. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Strange. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for yielding me a few seconds. I won't take it, but thank you all witnesses for your good testimony. A couple of things. The high costs associated with shipbuilding are often attributed to the time elapsed between building, and you've had some success in both the Arleigh Burke and the Virginia-class sub when you've done multi-year procurements. Is there any reason to think that that wouldn't potentially yield similar cost-saving results if applied to other programs like carriers, for example?
Senator, we've found that once you have a stable design, we've just come through the lead carrier.
Yep.
So as you look forward and you say, yes, I'm not going to be introducing great change to the carrier, there are opportunities we have done 2-year block buy on carriers in the past, or 2 carrier block buys in the past. And so it's certainly something that if we can make the commitment to the supplier base, it is effective, and we can get savings. We do try to look, after we get through a lead ship, to get into multi-years as soon as we possibly can and be able to introduce capability incrementally. So yes, sir, we find that giving the industry that predictability, and it's not just at the shipyard level, but the supplier level too, is critical.
Second question is, there was a Bloomberg article in the last day or so that talked about something that we might be seeing. You talked about an additional presidential budget coming over, I think, with respect to the second LCS. I'm a strong LCS fan, but my understanding from the article is part of the funding for that second is going to be reducing aircraft overhaul by $300 million. Is that accurate? And if that's so, give me some kind of context as to why that's a good idea and what it would mean.
So, sir, I won't speculate on what will be in the OMB submission to you, but I will tell you what you decided is inaccurate.
Okay.
It would not be a source coming out of overhaul funds, for
Okay.
example.
Are you familiar with the Bloomberg piece that I just referenced? And so as far as you know right now, that is not an accurate article.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the service of our witnesses today, so thank you all three very much. I wanted to focus, not surprisingly for some of my colleagues on the panel, on our Arctic strategy. We are an Arctic nation because of my great state, the state of Alaska. Secretary Mattis, during his confirmation hearing, said the Arctic is key strategic terrain, in part because of the new opportunities there, new challenges. The Russians are building up their ice-breaking fleet, their Navy, their brigade, 4 new brigade combat teams in the Arctic, very aggressively probing countries, 5 Bear bomber runs just in the Alaska airspace in the last month and a half, where we've had to go intercept them with our F-22s up in Alaska. So in this committee mandated that the Secretary of Defense put out a new Arctic strategy, which the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration did, which was a much better improvement on the old one, which was not really a strategy, but more of a document with a lot of nice pictures in it. One of the elements of the new Arctic strategy is that we, to protect our interests and sovereignty in the region, need to be able to conduct FONOPs in the Arctic. And yet Admiral Richardson just testified before this committee, said it's absolutely true, we don't have the capacity or the capability to conduct Arctic FONOPs. So our strategy right now has an end state that we can't meet. It's very obvious. So, Admiral, I wanted to talk a little bit about, as we look to pursue a fleet of 355 ships, what are the current plans in the Navy to include ice hardening of any ships that we're obviously going to need to be able to conduct FONOPs and protect our interest in the region?
Senator,
And if so, what ships would we be looking at to ice harden?
right. So I will take this for the record as well to give you a more detailed, fulsome answer. Right now, I'm unaware of any current plans, and Allison, if you choose to correct me, please do so, for ice hardening. The Navy's...
So why is that? I mean, we've been focused on it. The Secretary's focused on it. We have a new strategy. It says we need to conduct FONOPs. We have one. I'm going to get to the icebreakers here in a minute, but...
Right. So the short answer is the Navy has a very active presence in the Arctic, but it's undersea and in the air right now, and it's not on the surface right now. So it's work.
Can you conduct a FONOP with the sub?
Not
the
way
obvious
we
one.
envision it. Exactly right. So it would depend on how you message that. So let me get back to you with the detail on the hardening of our ships. Are you aware of any ongoing work with that?
I'm not aware, but...
Mr. Chairman, this is actually a really important issue, right? We're looking to build a 355-ship Navy. We have an Arctic strategy. The CNO is saying we can't conduct what we are saying we're supposed to do in our strategy, and we have no plans to ice harden our ships. And we're going to increase our ships by 600 or 60 ships. Yeah, I think we need a very detailed answer on why that's not even being considered. Seems to me a huge oversight. I appreciate that. Let me get to the icebreaker issue. The Coast Guard has talked about the need for 3 heavy icebreakers, 3 medium icebreakers. Again, Admiral Richardson stated in his confirmation hearing that it's clearly in the national interest for the U.S. to have more than 1 heavy icebreaker. Right now we have 2, but one's broken, and that was commissioned in 1976. I went and toured it recently. I think it was shameful. We should have no man or woman who puts the uniform of the U.S. military on that should deploy on a ship that's that old and broken. And you should go see it, Admiral. It's really shameful for our Coast Guard men and women to have to deploy on that. Initially, the estimated cost of one single icebreaker was 10 years it would take and $1 billion to build. The Norwegians just built the first ever liquid natural gas powered medium icebreaker for $150 million. So what are we doing wrong here? What can we be doing? And is the Navy working with the Coast Guard on trying to get at least the original? The target is 2023. I think it needs to be sooner. But why are we talking 10 years and $1 billion to build a ship? We put a man on the moon in a shorter amount of time. That everybody else is doing it. What's the problem, and how are we going to fix it? And how are we going to get Navy, Coast Guard, cooperation and working together on this issue, which seems to have a little bit of a hot potato? No service wants to own it, yet everybody says it's in our national interest to do it. How are we addressing this?
Sir, we are working very closely with the Coast Guard, and it's a joint program office right now on the icebreaker. There are two memorandums of understanding that we've signed, one at the Department of Homeland Security level and Department of Navy. I signed for the Navy. On the other one is the Navy with the Coast Guard, and there are a little different nuances in both, but both of them reference that the Coast Guard's mission is ice breaking, and so Coast Guard will have the lead on this, and Navy's in a supporting role. We're providing technical assistance with them. We're providing program management type support, contracting if they need it. We're participating in their reviews. I sit with the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard on all of their reviews. I can tell you that they're going through every single requirement and questioning them. And we're driving the cost of that ship. It is not going to be $1 billion ship. I'm not sure the 10 years wasn't tied to when funding might become available. Obviously, we're looking at how do you bring that in, subject to funding. But we are very much engaged with the Coast Guard. We have a great working relationship with them, and we're working very closely together to get this program on solid footing at an affordable cost.
And is the target of 2023 still doable?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Subject to funding availability, but yes, sir. We're doing design work right now. We have five industry teams providing great insight on where cost drivers are, so that we can get the specifications right to get this out for bid. There is $150 million that the Congress appropriated as part of the Navy's budget last year that will go towards the detailed design, and then the construction funding will have to follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this committee needs to keep a very close oversight role here, because there's just a lot we need to do, and the coordination between the Navy and the Coast Guard has not been that good. It's glad to hear that it's improving.
Senator Sullivan, you have raised a very important topic, and let me just ask this. Admiral Lescher, you have taken a few questions for the record, and perhaps others of you, and I appreciate that, because we want to get the right information to the committee. And this does provide a record for us to look at in the future. But these should be fairly easy for you to get back to us about. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. So again, the answer was neither of us are aware of a program for hardening of the ships to operate. But I want to just go back and do a quick check, make sure that's factual.
Okay. So on all of these things, you think maybe you could get back to us in 2 weeks?
Yes.
On all of the things you've taken for the record. Thank you. And Ms.
right.
Stiller is nodding yes also. So do appreciate that. And Senator Shaheen is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here and for your service to the country. I apologize for missing your opening statements, but I understand that there was some discussion about how to get to a 355-ship Navy. The question that I have is, how did we arrive at 355 as the appropriate number, and how do we break down the components of that 355 number in a way that provides for the national security that we think we need?
Yes, ma'am. So the analytical basis for the force structure assessment is it takes a look, really starting with combatant commander requirement to execute the strategy. And so the current strategy we have is the Quadrennial Defense Review Strategy of 2014. It talks about everything from ensuring a safe and secure nuclear deterrent, which drives the requirement for our ballistic missile submarines, to building peace and security globally, which drives our presence requirement, our so-called Phase 0, Phase 1, set the theater forces to deter, coercion, and defeat when necessary, which drives capability and high end. So as we integrate those strategic requirements, that's the charter to the Navy, these are the missions to execute. We did an analytic basis. Each of the commanders made an assessment of this is what I need in my theater in Central Command, in Pacific Command, to execute the strategy that I've been assigned. That essentially boils down to essentially a contract the Navy has with the nation to provide rotational forces forward for presence, and then to surge forces for crisis. And that's the analysis that was done, that culminated with a number of options, and the best military advice of the service leadership was 355 is the right recommendation to the nation. It's not a zero-risk force, but it's a moderate risk we can execute. And so that really is the analytic basis that looks at the current security environment and the current requirements to execute the strategy. Of course, the security environment is very dynamic, and so the resurgent Russia, North Korea, et cetera.
Well, along those lines, I was surprised to hear in testimony before the full committee, probably in the last couple of months, that we expect China to get to a 350-ship Navy by 2020. So how concerned are we about that and about our capacity at that point to be able to offset what we expect China to be doing?
Yes, ma'am. That's a great question. Though we don't mirror image platform versus platform,
Sure.
That's not the way we fight. And so you hear the CNO and the Secretary talk very extensively beyond the platforms and beyond, and obviously numbers absolutely matter, to your point. But our view of executing that strategy to include the deter, coercion, and defeat when required has to do with the innovation that will be taking place concurrently with growing the ship to the 355 level. And so that's everything from new technology and the investments you see in this budget in unmanned, directed energy, digital elements, networking, electromagnetic maneuver warfare, and then new operational concepts, distributed maritime.
Well, and given that, how important, I guess this is for Ms. Stiller, how important is it that we maintain a robust industrial base?
Ma'am, it's vital that we have a robust industrial base, and we watch that very carefully. We watch critical suppliers. We rely on our shipyards to identify critical suppliers that we might not see. So it's very important that we have that industrial base there to be able to help us grow.
And one of the shipyards I'm concerned about is our public shipyard at Portsmouth, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Can you talk about the role that the public shipyards play in making sure that we have the naval capability that we need?
Yes, ma'am, they are also vital because we have to have our public shipyards in place to address our nuclear-capable ships and their maintenance and modernization availabilities. And so it's very important that we invest in our naval shipyards. Admiral Lescher talked earlier about we're ramping up the number of folks that are going to be in our public shipyards. We're also looking at infrastructure improvements. What do we need to do to position ourselves so that those public yards can also be more productive, and allow the proper throughput that we need to support our fleet?
And I appreciate the challenges that the Navy has given Congress's failure to address the budget issues. I remember being at the first Navy caucus, and Admiral Richardson pointed out that they've instructed agencies within the department not to plan on doing anything in the first quarter because of the budget uncertainty, because we've had so many years of continuing resolutions and lack of budget certainty. So maybe you could all speak to what that means as we're trying to address the challenges that we face around our national security.
I'll start. So what we see under a continuing resolution, and as you have precisely described, every year for the last 8 or 9 years, we're starting with a continuing resolution. It's very inefficient. It constrains their ability to execute the program. The CNO has talked about essentially running the department on 3/4, of a year from a planning perspective. The technical aspects of a continuing resolution, we can't do new starts, we can't do production rate increases. So from an industrial base to building an industrial base, we're driving a lot of churn and that. Our inability to execute the ship depot maintenance in the private shipyards on the scheduled plan means we took availabilities planned for the first quarter, and we're pushing them in the second, third quarter. So churn again now in our private shipyards as they're trying to have a stable labor force. It's very inefficient on the government workforce. So instead of signing a year-long contract, for example, to execute a service, it's broken down into multiple contract actions at the same time as we're driving to 25% reduction in management headquarters, at the same time as we're driving very strongly to auditability for the force. So it drives workload inefficiency, and it absolutely costs the taxpayer money to do it that way.
If I could, Senator, to add on to what Admiral Lescher said is, like he said, I think 9 out of the last 10 years we've been operating under CRs. I think we've had over 30 continuing resolutions, and it just gives us instability in our readiness and our modernization plans. So if you kind of look at, as Admiral Lescher kind of walked through and said, the Secretary of Defense has a campaign plan in 17 to fix readiness, 18 to kind of continue to solve the readiness issues, fill those holes, increase some of that modernization capability, and then now start to modernize and grow the force. Without the stability, you could see that looks good from this plan 17 on, but if we don't get the stability that we need, then we don't solve the readiness, and therefore you can't have the stability you need to modernize.
I think they hit all the points.
I think they did. Thank you.
Thank you. In his opening, Chairman Wicker addressed the cost of the USS Enterprise, and I know that Chairman McCain mentioned this recently at the Navy posture hearing. So I understand the cost was projected to increase from $11.4 billion to $13 billion, a whopping $1.6 billion, but I also have heard some reports that the cost is under review and may be revised downward. Ms. Stiller, could you update the committee on your current cost estimate for the Enterprise? Is it $13 billion or is it something less?
Sir, it's something less. It's at $12.6 billion, and when we send the amended budget over for the additional LCS, we intend to send a budget exhibit that reflects that. You won't see a reduction in the FY18 column. As you know, that ship is incrementally funded, but you'll see a net reduction to the cost of the Enterprise.
So that's a good news story.
Yes, sir.
$400 billion. I'm not great at math, but that's what, about a 4%, 5% decrease?
Yes, sir.
That? What accounts for that late-breaking savings?
We looked hard at what we were counting on as inflation rates, which we're not experiencing at this particular point in time. We also looked at the effect of where we've added the 2nd Virginia class in FY21 and what that does to rates at the shipyard. So those were the two large drivers there. We're also looking at efficiencies we're seeing on 79.
When you say inflation rates in what? Could you be more specific?
Inflation rate for material specifically, and a lot of times shipbuilding inflation rates don't mirror the rest of the world or the rest of the country, but we're seeing that coming more in line, and so we don't feel like we have to address larger inflation.
Do you think we might anticipate the possibility of future downward revisions as well?
We'll continue to scrub the numbers as we get there, and obviously as we get to contract on that ship. That may also, but yes, sir. And we are also looking at efficiencies we're seeing today on 79, and we'll apply those to CVN 80.
Thank you. That's good news. I would like to turn my attention now to the undersea domain. In terms of the program cost, the Ohio class replacement, the Columbia class, is going to be, I think, only second to the Joint Strike Fighter. And those submarines are going to carry about 70% of the nation's deployed ballistic missiles, obviously the most survivable part of our nuclear triad. But if the Columbia class turns into an acquisitions debacle, the way some of our big programs have in the past, that wouldn't just be very bad consequences for the taxpayer, it'd be grave consequences for the safety of our nation. So what steps are we taking to ensure that we get the Columbia class right from lessons learned on past acquisition experiences, especially with the 78?
Yes, sir. We are robustly, along with industry, managing this program. The Congress, you've given us authorities that we feel will help us to drive cost and efficiency into the program, and we thank you for those. and we're continuing to look for if there are additional authorities we might need. We're carefully watching how the shipyards are able to, what they plan to do for facilities to be ready for Columbia. We're looking at what critical skills do they need to hire and how they're going to get ahead of that so that we're not in a situation where we don't have the skilled workforce we need. We're looking at critical vendors to make sure they can ramp up as they're building attack submarines and Columbia class. We're looking at synergies where we need to support the UK because they also are building their replacement. So for example, common missile compartment. We know we haven't built the missile tubes in over 40 years since we built the Ohio. And so we see that there's synergies to go ahead and build continuously those missile tubes to make sure we're getting risk out of the program. So I can assure you there are a lot of lessons learned that we're applying today. I mentioned earlier, our intent is not to start construction until we're over 80%. We're targeting 83% complete with design on that program. So right now, all the metrics are leaning in the right direction. We're on track with design, but it's not something that we're going to take our eye off of. It is critical to us, and we fully understand your concerns.
Thank you. Admiral Lescher, turning our attention to attack submarines. Admiral Harris recently testified that only about half of his requirements for attack submarines in the Pacific theater is being met, and the challenge is only going to grow more in the 2020s as we retire these at a faster rate than they're planning to be built. China continues to expand its fleet, and many other nations in East and Southeast Asia go on something of a attack submarine buying spree of their own. What steps is the Navy taking to try to mitigate this shortfall in attack submarines, especially as it relates to the Asia-Pacific theater?
So a number of steps I would cite. First is obviously the path we're on to grow the number that are being purchased. Beyond that, we're making strong investments to make the submarines we do have more capable and execute their missions more broadly as well. So some of the investments you see in this budget to get at that are, for example, the investments in the family of underwater unmanned vehicles. So this will allow any submarine across the spectrum of that family. So there's small, medium, large, and then extra large. The ones that are deployable on submarines will actually execute subsets of missions for that submarine, whether it's ISR or other missions. We could talk in a different forum to make the ones we do have forward more capable. Similar to that is the investment, obviously, in the Virginia payload module. So that, again, makes the submarines we have, particularly for Admiral Harris in that theater, able to carry broader types of weapons that will make them just more effective in what they do. So it's a combination of growing capacity and then growing capability to make the ones we have more effective.
Thank you.
Ms. Stiller, before I turn to Senator Blumenthal, let me follow up on an important matter that Senator Cotton mentioned, and that is of avoiding an acquisition budget disaster on these big programs. And the Senator mentioned the F-35. At what point will we have a comfort level that this new replacement, the Columbia-class submarine, is proceeding as you expect it to do in terms of a cost?
We have an integrated master schedule that the shipyards collectively have put together on how they're going to get through the design products, what they need to do from an integrated schedule on having the facilities in place, and I mentioned the workforce. And it's something that we, on a very regular drumbeat at the program executive officer level, is reviewing. We can't just review Columbia in isolation. We have to make sure we're looking at Virginia and Virginia payload module to make sure that we are, we don't have one program getting out of step with the other. So I can tell you that at senior leadership, Admiral Caldwell, Director of Naval Reactors, and I are going to take a trip up to Electric Boat this summer to review both programs in detail. This is Mr. Stackley and Admiral Caldwell did this last year. We're going to make this an annual day-long review, but we have regular reviews in the building to go through the program. So if we start to see things going not in the right direction, we're going to put the attention and focus to make sure we get it back on track But I can tell you that we're managing very, very carefully because it is critical.
It is critical, absolutely. Thank you, and Senator Blumenthal, you're recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to assure Senator Wicker and Senator Cotton that there is a very strong program of oversight and scrutiny in place to avoid any of the kinds of mishaps that have plagued other programs. And I have been briefed. I'm sure that Electric Boat would be more than happy to brief anyone on our committee or any member of the Senate for that matter. But there's a very strong sense that the tradition of producing submarines on time and on or under budget, as has happened with the Virginia-class, has to be continued into the Columbia program, even though it is a much more complex, well, I shouldn't say more complex, it is certainly a challenging and, as you have observed, Senator Cotton, a critically important part of our national defense.
I'll just add that I appreciate those comments. This is something that's bipartisan. Obviously, nobody on this subcommittee or our full committee wants to see something like what happened with the F-35, whether it's the Columbia class or the B-21. We have experts and professionals that handle these matters, but it's incumbent upon us to have these kind of regular check-ins.
And we want to be teammates in this regard. So tell us what you need with regard to authority. And,
Yes, sir. You've given us the authorities that we've asked for. We don't have additional authorities that we need this year, but we certainly know that we can come back and bring you additional authorities as we see them. We're continually challenging the team, the government industry team. Are there better ways to go procure that we would need additional authorities? Don't be constrained by current authorities. Right now, we have what we need, but we certainly will come back if we need additional ones.
okay, well, maybe someday we'll look back on this little discussion and be able to pat ourselves collectively on the back that we did our part. But when we do something new and something big, Senator Cotton has raised a very legitimate concern. So we acknowledge that. And start Senator Blumenthal's time over, if you don't mind, Mr. Clerk.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Even though I don't have authorization to do it, I'd like to invite you to visit Electric Boat, and we can
I've been there,
our,
and I'll come back.
And I would just like to tell you that Ms. Stiller christened the USS Mississippi, one of the more recent Virginia attack submarines, in a dramatic show of force.
I'm sure it was one of the highlights of her life, actually.
Well, she did very well, and she's done important service to our nation. And in all seriousness, we thank you and the other witnesses who are here for your service to our nation. And I hope that we can continue this conversation because it is critically important, and it is bipartisan. And with respect to authority, I know that in the NDA FY17, continuous production was authorized for the Columbia-class common missile compartment, which allows the industrial base to continue manufacturing that component. Are there additional authorities, just to follow up on the chairman's question, that you might need for other components or other aspects so that you don't have to, in effect, produce boat by boat, and you can do continuously the production of things like the missile compartment?
We are looking very hard in different areas of the boat. Right now, we have not identified that we need the additional authorities, but we may come back to you and say we see merit in other areas. But right now, we are comfortable with the authorities that we have.
Great. Let me turn to the security clearance backlog. I know you're familiar with it. Secretary Stackley recently called the decision to assign, I think, 10 reservists to some of the work that otherwise would be done by others, the result of the backlog for submarine construction, clearances, and I wonder whether the Navy will continue extending that detail if necessary, and what can we do to help to end this backlog, which is really regrettable.
Yes, sir. What Secretary Stackley has assigned 10 reservists to help clear within the Department of Defense, within the DoD, to help clear getting these interim secret clearances so that workers can go and work in secret areas of the ship. The yard was having to fence off when they couldn't get people cleared for a long time. What that doesn't solve is getting their permanent clearances, because that's at the OPM level, and we collectively have got to figure out how to correct that. We did ask that this be a one-time, but we recognize the criticality to our industrial base, and so we'll have to look at it, each as time goes on, to see if we need to continue to supplement in that area.
He called this assignment, I'm quoting him, an extreme measure.
Yes, sir.
Which we would have difficulty repeating. And, although it sounds mundane, it is critically important to the work done at the yard, as you well understand.
Yes, sir.
So I hope that you'll let us know whether there's anything we can do to help. And I understand that last week the Navy approved Electric Boat's revised security plan, which seeks to allow non-cleared workers in certain parts of the shipyard.
Yes, sir.
Which is important, and a formal letter for approval is forthcoming. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask, I know you've been asked about maintenance, and particularly about the Boise, which I understand is going to be done in a private shipyard because the public yards are so fully operational. They're operating at capacity. Is that going to be a trend that we see expanded in the future? That is, the use of more private yards for maintenance? And I ask this question because not only the Boise, USS Boise, has to be really returned to sea. Right now it's tied up pierside, can't be used by the Navy, but also because the skill challenges, the training, the capacity challenges that we face, I think are the biggest obstacle in some ways to achieving the goals in timeliness and cost for Columbia and for the Virginia class and for maintenance. So if the maintenance burden is going to add to the private sector, it makes all the more important the skill training and building that defense industrial base capacity that right now is in jeopardy, in my view. So let me invite your comments.
Sir, we want to make sure that we're doing the right things, we believe, to get the naval shipyards to the ability to handle the capacity for the depot work. You're right, with Boise, we've hit a stumbling block. We're now having to do the planning, and it will go to the private sector to do that availability. I don't anticipate there'll be a tremendous amount of work pushed to the private sector, but it is something, you're exactly right, that we have to carefully watch, because the new construction, especially Columbia, is very vital that it stays on schedule. It is important that we have the workforce across the board. So your points are well taken. Right now, we don't see additional ships being pushed to the private sector, but it's something that, if we see it happening, we need to make sure we're working with private industry early so that they're aware of what's coming. Anything on your end, Bill?
And thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Blumenthal. Ms. Stiller, as we grow the fleet, we're going to need more propellers. Is that correct? And I understand the Navy's chatting with Rolls-Royce in Pascagoula about this issue. Can you update me on these discussions?
Yes, sir. Back in 2014 timeframe, I became aware that the Rolls-Royce facility, the foundry in Pascagoula, was looking to shutter, and that caused us great concern because, as you know, a number of our ship propellers are cast and machined in that facility. And the only other facility we have in this country that does the castings is the Philadelphia foundry, the Naval foundry. And they work primarily on our submarine propulsors. So been talking in conversations with the Rolls-Royce leadership for some time now, and we have done things to help to have them stay open. We advanced the CVN 80 propeller work to make sure that they had workload in the facility. And we've been working with the offices of the Secretary of Defense's staff to figure out, are there alternatives or things that we can do to help them invest in their facility to make it more productive. And so they've come to us with a proposal. We've looked at Title III, the defense procurement authorities, which require presidential approval, and that's a lengthy process. But there is a program within the Secretary of Defense's office called the Industrial Base Analysis and Sustainment, IBAS program, that might offer us an opportunity to work with the company, investment from the company, as well as investment from the government to help keep that facility more productive and give them the tools they need so that they can be there to help us grow our future fleet. So that's one example of a supplier-based issue that we are tackling one at a time, but we need to make sure that we're doing that so that we have our critical suppliers there as we grow the force.
Well, keep us posted on that, and I'd point out to you that Pascagoula is, to my knowledge, the only city in America that rhymes with hallelujah. So
yes, sir.
I give a hallelujah to your answer there. And let me ask you then, Ms. Stiller, on the LXR schedule for 2020. Given the need for 355 ships and including 38 amphibs, could this LXR be accelerated to 2019, and would additional funding be required?
Yes, sir, you're correct. The LXR in our budget is a 2020 ship. The critical enabler to getting to an accelerated ship would be funding for detailed design and advanced procurement of long lead time items. So if that funding were available, the ship would more likely execute like an FY19 ship than it would an FY20 ship. But you'd need that advanced work done to be prepared to do that.
Well, let us know what you need there. And Senator Hirono.
Thank you. So on the LXR program, which you say is a 2020 execution, and the question was whether we can accelerate that, because that would be good. And did you say that that acceleration is dependent on funding?
Yes, ma'am. It's dependent on being able to do the detailed design work so that the design is ready so that you can get into construction. And so right now, all that funding is in FY20. If that part of that money was accelerated, you could execute that ship more like an FY19 ship.
So we need to accelerate the funding to enable you to do the detailed design work that's that's needed. Okay, there was an earlier discussion about our submarines being in dry dock, and the number 3 was mentioned, 3 subs. I thought it was only the Boise that was in dry dock. Admiral?
When you say in dry dock, meaning?
Well, we can't. They are not
capacity limit? Well, I know,
deployable.
well, for example, we have USS Montpelier right now also in a private shipyard as well. So that was an FY17 avail that was rolled in and is being done now. So I think, as Secretary Stiller said, on a case-by-case basis, where the capacity is not there, they're looking to bring them into the private shipyards.
I'm not sure I understand. So there are 3. There are 3 submarines right now that should be deployable, except that they're needing to be repaired. That is not accurate, is it?
We'll have to find out.
I'm not talking about bringing on
in terms of
a submarine that had already been.
Yeah, so right. So Montpelier is in maintenance. So correct. And then in terms of an example like Boise, where it's lost its certification to submerge.
Yes.
Boise is the one example of that right now.
All right. In terms of the capability of our shipyard workers, you mentioned, Admiral, that 50% of our shipyard workers have less than 5 years experience. I don't know how many years of experience will be necessary. I'm sure that's not exactly something that you can just pinpoint. But are we doing certain things to accelerate their capabilities through training, whatever we can do?
Yeah, that's a great question. In each of our 4 public shipyards, you'll see a tremendous focus on this training of the new hires. As a matter of fact, each of the 4 shipyards is participating in a community of excellence to share best practices on how you take, new levels and turn them into artisans and qualified to do the maintenance. And so that is investments both in those training programs. You'll see investments in mock-ups so that they can, the new hires can go to specific areas and go through the processes that they'll have to do on the submarines as well. So there's a very heavy focus on recognizing that and training our people properly, and I think we're really starting to see traction on that.
That's very good. Please keep that up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Ranking Member, let's agree that members need to get their questions for the record in, within 5 business days. Is that all right? Without objection, that'll be the rule in this case, and I do hope that things taken for the record, you could get back to us in 2 weeks after they're submitted. And I want to thank the witnesses and members of the subcommittee for a very informative and valuable hearing. Unless there's further comment, we are adjourned.